Like the famed ghost towns of the Western Gold Rush era, coal mines in the East have left their mark. Throughout the coal fields, towns that served their purpose and reached oblivion dot the landscape. One such town is Tams, West Virginia, settled in 1908 by W.P. Tams Jr. The town once supported 1,200 people and boasted a bowling alley, swimming pool, movie theater, church, and store. Today, few homes are left. The store is now an office for another coal company. But the man who built the town remains, living in the cottage he built 63 years ago. Now in his 90th year, Major Tams describes Tams as a ghost town and himself as its chief ghost. Many operators, upon establishing their coal operations, moved on to larger cities. Why did you never leave Tams?
Well, because principally I like it here. To use an old expression, I think that Julius Caesar first used it. He'd rather be first in a village than second in Rome. I had no particular desire to live in a big city, never have had. When I was younger, I liked to go to New York for a few days, but never had any desire to live in any such place.
You stayed in the town of Tams and oversaw the operations all the years.
This has been my headquarters ever since 1st of April, 1909. For 6 months before that, I had rented a cottage from Mr. Captain across the mountain at Slab Fork. Came over here every day on survey business, running a transit up over these mountains. And as soon as it was possible to get supplies here, I had this cottage built, moved here April the 1st, 1909. It's been my headquarters ever since.
In the time you've lived here, you've built the town of Tams. Wasn't it considered a beautiful town?
We thought so, that we had the advantage, small as it seems to you, the amount of level ground here is a great deal more than the average mine town had available. And that gave us a chance to build a decent town and to maintain it in decent shape. For example, our neighbor across the mountain and my good friend, the Capitans, had to build their town in a ravine that had practically no level land. A great disadvantage. They built and maintained a nice town in spite of it, but we did have the advantage here of this bottomland.
When you decided to build a coal mine, you couldn't actually choose the land for its flatness, could you?
You have to use the land that's adjacent to the land that you have leased, the coal land. In those days, with no good roads, in fact no roads, you couldn't, as you can easily today, you couldn't then build a town several miles away. The men would have to walk 3 or 4 miles to get to work and walk back in the evening.
Well,
you had to use the land adjacent to where you were opening the coal mine.
And the land that you chose was on what's called the Winding Gulf, isn't that right? This area is called the Winding Gulf.
Yes, incidentally, in the old days they used the old spelling. It was G-U-L-P-H.
I see.
Winding Gulf. Call that from the fact that its head, and 25 miles length, its head's only 4 miles from its delivery point.
Why did you choose this area? What happened when you first came into the area?
The Sewell seam, which was the principal seam mined in Fayette County, was pretty well taken up with leases. The Beckley seam, which occurred over in this area, had not been attacked, but in 1 or 2 places it was obviously the coming seam. If I may take a little time, coal seams lie in lenses,
You're referring to the shape.
elongated lenses extending from the northeast to the southwest in length, and in the short way, the dip of the land to the northwest. They resulted from the fact that as one seam was formed and then went down underwater and was covered with 100, 200 feet maybe of detritus from the washing down of the Appalachian Range, and then the action of the earth raising up above the water level. The low point was always the center of the lens, always moving as each successive seam was formed, moving to the northeast. And it was obvious that this Beckless seam center was on the winding gulf, that the geologic movement that made the gulf a draining point had made it the center point of the cellulose growth that became a coal seam when it in turn went down below water. I felt sure that this was the axis, so I came over in the winter of 1905 to verify that, came over here and found it correct, that the seam was the thickest here on the Gulf on each side, and then moved as best I could to secure a lease in this area. If I may take a few more minutes, back in 1887, the state passed a statute to establish public schools, and to do so by selling off land that had been forfeited for non-payment of taxes, use the proceeds to start the public schools. A great deal of the land here and over on the Norfolk and Western had been enlarged patents owned in Virginia that had been given to men who had been officers in the Revolution in payment for their services given by the state of Virginia. After the Civil War, those people were unable to meet the taxes which West Virginia very naturally raised considerably for that purpose. The result was the lands were forfeited, and people from Pennsylvania particularly, who were experienced in coal lands and their value, came down here and bought up those forfeited lands, which were in those days called school lands, just from the fact that the proceeds of their sales for non-payment of taxes was going to the building of schools. In this particular area, a group of Pennsylvania wealthy people from Philadelphia principally sent a young man, Logan Bullitt, a young lawyer down here, who started on a creek near Beckley, then extended on down this way till altogether he had assembled and bought about 47 or 8,000 acres of land, of which the largest block, 10,000 acres, was right here, comprised what was afterwards the mines Slab Fork, Tams, McAlpin, and Stotesbury. I had an uncle who was connected with the coal business, president of the New River Consolidated Coal Company, a sales company, and he had happened to be a classmate and fraternity mate of Mr. William C. Bullitt, who was the president then of the Beaver Coal Company. So I went to my uncle, asked him to use his connection with Mr. Bullitt to secure a lease. He was not a technical man, and I had a terrible time explaining to him what the maps were and making sure he didn't get the wrong lease.
He owned the land, but he didn't understand it.
Mr. Bullitt gave my uncle a choice of two leases, one on the Slab Fork side, right beside Slab Fork, which already was trying to build a town in a ravine, and two towns in that ravine would have been hopeless. It was already developed by a railway. The main line of the Virginian had already passed there. It could be opened. There was a big temptation to a young fellow to take what he could immediately get. The alternate was a lease on the Gulf that had no railway and no immediate prospect of one, but had this better land for a town. So I took a chance. I knew that the Virginian had spent $60 million building the railway and had no mines of any consequence on it, that they would be compelled either to throw away the $60 million and abandon the main line or build a 20-mile extension up the Gulf. And I took that chance, and they did have to do it. So within a year, they had let the contract for the Winding Gulf branch and were busily at work grading it.
During the meantime, were you building the mine here?
Yes, when I went to work, beyond survey work, actually starting to build the town, the railway had gotten graded up within a few miles of here. They were grading right at this point. And incidentally, the railway had laid a line right up through the center of the town, which would have been disastrous to me, center of what was going to be the town. So I had to persuade the Virginian Railway to alter its line and lay it along the edge of the bottomland as it now runs up here, which naturally it didn't want to do. So I drew a plan of the proposed town and took it to the head of the Virginian Railway, told him I would build that, and if his track was running in the middle of it, I would incorporate the town and pass an ordinance that he'd have to break any train at each cross street and would be allowed only 10 minutes to stop at any time. Mr. DePee was a cooperative man, and he got the message. His chief engineer, Mr. Fernstrom, a Swede, was bitterly opposed, but Mr. DePee, the vice president and general manager, turned to Fernstrom and said, "Fernstrom, this damn young fool will do just that. Go ahead and change your line."
And so you had the railroad away from the middle of the bottomland.
I had no intention of incorporating the town,
Oh, really?
of course.
Then you started to build the town and the coal mine. How did you arrange the town?
First we had no road. The road from Beckley,
Now, how far away is Beckley?
by the route available then, it was 16 miles away. The first 6 miles you could take a wagon over from Beckley to what is now the town of Sophie. At that time, there were only 2 log cabins on the Soak Creek branch, one at the mouth of it, one up at the head. No Sophie. Town ended there, and then there was what in those days was called a trace, just a bridle path that you could take horseback. From there to get over, came down not as you drove in today, down the Alderson branch, but the Bailey Creek branch, that's now called a Powder Holler, and then it turned, went down the Gulf 5 miles to the mouth of Stone Coal, and up Stone Coal to Plas Lily's farm, about 5 or 6 miles, and there's not even a bridle path, not a trace. There was no bridle path for the 8 miles from the mouth of Stone Coal down to Mullins. There was no bridle path from here up to the head of the Gulf. If I wanted to go up the Gulf, I had to put my horse in the middle of the creek, because on each side of the winding Gulf, the laurel and rhododendron thickets were so close, so impossible of getting through, that if you went from one side of the holler to another, it would take you half a day to cut your path through. The only way you could travel until the railway was graded was up the creek.
So in essence, you were isolated from anything outside.
Well, that's the exact answer. I had to get a sawmill here, so we had to hack away from what's now Sophie, the end of the road that would take a wheeled vehicle, to haul that sawmill over here and plant it 100 yards above where we are sitting now. In the meantime, I had bought from the Beaver Company, they reserved the timber which they had sold to Ritter Lumber Company. I had to buy 30 acres of it to clear what we afterwards called Colored Town, and the timber that we sawed there and down below here we used in the framework of the houses. We would cut a tree down, for instance today, saw it up into joists, studs, planks, and build a frame of a house with it at the same place where the stump was the next day. And by the time the railway had got graded and the track laid up here, we had a town, had opened up drift mouth of the Beckley mine up on the hill. We hadn't got our tipple going because it required machinery that couldn't be hauled over the mountain. We had to wait till the railway with a track could bring the machinery. So for the first 6 months, we slid the coal that we were digging in a chute down the side of the mountain, then wheeled it in a little push car over, loading about 2,000 or 3,000 tons a month to enable us to get into the coal and get the mine started in development. After 6 months, we had completed the tipple and gotten the machinery and had the conveyors to bring the coal down the hill and the level conveyor to pull it out to where it could dump and be loaded into cars. That we got on April of 1910, April the 1st, we got our permanent tipple going, and in September we loaded 30-some thousand tons. We had gone from 3,000 tons a month to 30-some thousand as soon as we got the proper facilities for handling it. We then, of course, we had a temporary store, but we had people here. We had to provide them with food, with clothing. In other words, we had to have a store that was practically a all-service store. We had to provide, the miners bought the powder, and we had to have a powder house and through the store sell powder daily to the men.
The powder was gunpowder or something to blast?
By the time we had opened here, we'd gotten to using stick powder, dynamite, not actual dynamite, but forms of that had been toned down that wouldn't shatter the coal to pieces. And we sold those sticks to the men. Had to do that daily. A man took his day's powder into the mine with him, used it that day. Next day, on his way in, he'd stop at the powder house, get what he needed for the day, caps, explosive, so forth, fuse, and carry that in with him. When he had come out the evening before, he left his picks at the blacksmith shop, where the points, the blacksmith sharpened them up again and tempered them, and he'd take his 3 or 4 picks, carry them into the mine, use them that day, making an undercut in the coal, drill his holes, load the holes with explosive, shoot it down, then shovel it into mine cars. In those days, there were 2 classes of men working in a mine, what were called company men. They were paid by the day. They laid track, they hung trolley wire while you were using trolleys, they graded hallways, ran locomotives, drove mules while you were hauling with mules. And the other class were coal loaders who worked piecework. They took a room, usually 2 of them, working from each side towards the middle, making an undercut, a kerf as it's called, 5 feet, maybe if a good miner, 6 feet deep, and then with a breast auger, drilling a hole, and that's hard work, tapping the hole, shooting the coal down, and then what's still harder work, shoveling it into mine cars. The coal loader laid his own track, 3x4 timbers, not steel rail. He was furnished by the company, the cross ties, the timbers, he laid it. He was furnished props, and he set the props to protect himself, set up the prop, came within an inch, say, of the roof, and then drove a wedge of wood on top of that to make it tight to hold the roof up. He was paid so much a carload, depending on the thickness of the coal. Naturally, if he's working on a thin 4-foot seam, then considered thin, he had to make the same undercut as up here, where we had 6 feet the top, this much parting, and 3.5 the bottom. And with one cut, he could shoot down 3 times as much coal as a man working in 4-foot coal, working where he could stand up as he shoveled. Instead of shoveling off his knees, he could load a lot more in a day with the same amount of physical effort. Naturally, he didn't get as much per car as a man had to be paid who worked the thin seam. That's why all the thicker seams were worked out in any coal area first. People went as a last resort to the thinner, Today, nothing is left in this county. I don't think more than 3.5 foot thick, and then you have to reject about 25% of that
It has
as being
four.
high ash.
Oh, I see.
My neighbor, Slab Falk, came over and put a preparation plant and a slope to the number 3 seam just above the town here. They took out what had been my old colored town, took down the houses and put their surface plant there. And you probably noticed as you drove in and out from here, right above here, as you turned up going up the mountain, trucks dropping a lot of.
It looked like the valley was
That's
being
the
filled
refuse
in.
that Slab Falk is loading 500 tons every day. They are hauling up there and depositing it, and the state now provides that they can only put 4 to 6 feet of that. Then they've got to put 2 feet of dirt on top of that and then go on.
And in that way fill up the entire valley.
When I had a cleaning plant here, I had a bucket line up over the mountain. I dropped the refuse into the next hollow, and there was no such requirement. One of the 15 or 20 reasons that I decided to get out of the business when I did.
We were talking about the early mining methods, the early days in coal mining. What kind of safety precautions did the miners take?
In the days when mining was strictly a man proposition, you didn't have the same dangers that you now have, because obviously, in the first place, take a drift mine. It's been exposed for several million years, the top seam here, to draining off the gas in the mine. So we found practically no gas there. When we went into the lower, look on this number 4 seam, it was sealed off and gas was in it, and it was a completely different thing. In the beginning with the Beckley mine, we had no gas troubles. We had to provide proper ventilation, that the man received 100 cubic feet per minute per man at the face of fresh air. Had to see that the roof was properly protected. And in those days you could do that because when you came to pull the pillars, you drove rooms up leaving pillars between them of coal to support the roof. When you came to pull those pillars, you used experienced men who had done pillar work regularly, who knew the sounds that the roof made, the groans and grunts that it made when it was about to break and come down. Today, there's complete mechanization. You drive 200 or 300 yards forward, you're tapping gas that hasn't drained off. If you happen to hit a pocket, you'll get it suddenly and a lot of it at once. You can only protect yourself by using lime dust, ground up fine lime dust, spread everywhere on the walls, the roof, everywhere, which will choke off any gas explosion right at the start, and even a coal dust explosion will be choked. That's been the greatest thing done in the last 40 years to reduce danger in the coal mines is rock dusting. The next is roof bolting, using an electric drill to drill a hole through the slate that isn't strong up into rock, sand rock, and driving bolts up there with washers on them, tighten the bolts up. In other words, bolts are loose shale and slate up to the sound main sandstone roof.
What was life in the coal camp like during the heyday of coal?
Well, the men, their wives, and their children were living over here in a community that could only be reached from the county seat, for instance, by driving from Beckley 6 miles out to the Virginian main line at Harper, taking the passenger train to Mullins, at Mullins taking the Winding Gulf branch passenger up here, taking a whole day. The same thing if a person here wanted to get to the county seat. If we got a man injured so badly that he had to get to a hospital, if he got injured after the passenger train went down at noon, he was out of luck because he wouldn't get to the hospital till the next day. In that situation, we had to provide not only a store that would furnish him everything his family wanted and needed in the way of food, clothing, and incidentally, coffins also. We carried them in stock. But we had to provide him with a reasonable amount of amusement, had to provide a company doctor, his family. So the first thing we had to do, and we had to provide churches. That meant in the white town, the white Americans were closest to the store, and below them were the white foreigners, and above the temple was colored town. We had to provide an amusement house, which I did in 1913. It consisted upstairs of a gymnasium that the young fellows could use, and that could be also used as a dance place. On the ground floor, a cafe, which was an extension of the store, a bowling alley, and 5 pool tables. We had to do the same thing then up in the colored area of town. In the basement of the one here, we had a swimming pool, which we had to heat the water for. We had to provide a movie house because movies had just come in. Everybody liked them. They didn't have sound. But I built the first movie house in Raleigh County. We didn't have one in Beckley. We had people come from Beckley over here to see what a movie was like. I built the first bathhouse for miners. The older operators laughed at it. Miners go home and the wife scrubs them on the back porch. They strip down to the waist and bend over the tub. The woman takes the same mop she mops the floor with and mops his back, which is true. I said, yes, they do that because there's nothing else they can do. But I built experimental frame building. It took about a half of the white miners. They flooded it. They wanted it badly. As soon as I made that test, I built a permanent big brick bathhouse where the men could go in their good clothes in the morning, drop down the hanger that had their work clothes, take off their good clothes, put on their work clothes, pull their good clothes back up to the ceiling and lock it where the chain went into a pipe to protect the thing from being shaken. Then everyone said the colored people don't take baths. I said they don't take them because they haven't had a chance to. I built a bathhouse up there, and of course, all the colored miners used it. We had one that didn't, an old fellow from Alabama who claimed that he was a Seminole Indian, probably did have a little Indian blood in him, said he'd never taken a bath in his life and believed he'd die if he took a bath. So we made an excuse and let him, but he had to live by himself. All of the men used the bathhouses. In 1926, the state of Virginia and the state of West Virginia, the legislatures, the same year, passed a law starting a good roads program. Senator Byrd, afterwards senator, then the governor in Virginia, stood up against his legislature and refused to let them bond the state, said they would build their roads with the money, license money, and tax on gasoline. Governor of West Virginia gave in, let the legislature pass a law bonding the state, passed a law creating a commission into which broken down politicians that the party in power at the moment felt they owned a debt to, and also passed a law that the chief engineer of the road had to be a West Virginian by birth. Governor Byrd in Virginia refused his legislature, who wanted the same things. He overruled it, said he'd get the best man wherever he came from for chief engineer. Got a very competent man who had been in charge of the Good Roads program in Maryland. He didn't burden him with a commission that would demand for the county of, by each one of the commission lived, a special road. And that result is that West Virginia has spent a huge amount of money and on balance does not have, they're beginning to get a fairly good system. They haven't got it yet. Virginia has had a good road system, and all the thanks that Governor Byrd, afterwards Senator Byrd, and now dead, all the thanks he gets for what he did is to be abused as having built up a political system in the state. But the first thing that it did in 26, it got us a workable dirt road that could be used. We could get to Beckley in an hour in the summer and about 2 hours in the winter. Immediately, everybody wanted to buy cars, and all the men came to me wanting to borrow money to buy a Ford. To protect myself, when I would tell a fellow who I knew wasn't saving enough to pay for his car, I would turn them down and protect myself by telling that fellow, I haven't got a car, why do you have to have a car? I've stuck to that and I still don't have a car. We ended up with 90 garages here in town, and I was almost the only person in town who didn't have a car and had to get a taxi to leave, and still am that way. But that created a tremendous difference. As soon as that they were able to get to Beckley, very shortly afterwards, sound came in for movies, and Beckley put in sound. No point now attempting it here because they could go to a better and bigger house in Beckley. So our movie house more or less died on the vine after 1928. We did have one advantage. Circuses could come here and set up between our white American section and the foreign section at the bottom end of town. And the Beckley people wanted to see a circus, they had to ride horseback over here to Tams to see a circus up until the good roads were built. And that way, by building a Union Protestant church open to all sorts, a Catholic church that was designed to take care of the ritual of both the Roman Catholic and the Greek Catholic. We had both types among the foreigners. And up in Colored Town, we had built a church available to any denomination. Then the chief denomination, the Baptists, wanted one of their own and raised half the money to build it with. The company furnished the other half, built it, got the Beaver Coal Corporation to join the company in deeding the land of the church to the church people, which deed is in existence as long as it's used as a church. It's still used as a church. Those various forms of catering to some form of amusement and religious practice had to be done.
The history of the coal union has a bloody background. Did you find this in Tams?
When we opened up here, there was no United Mine Workers in Raleigh County. Generally speaking, south of the two rivers, the Potomac and the Ohio, coal mines were non-union, with the exception of certain parts of northern West Virginia. And above the two rivers, they were unionized. The result of that was that to stay non-union and have freedom of action in testing different ways of coal mining without having to get permission from some union president in Washington or somewhere, as non-union, we paid 10% more wages than the union contract that was made each year, with the result that we couldn't cut wages because we were non-union down to unreasonable levels, or we'd become unionized. The union couldn't make unreasonable demands each year for increases because we could supply the country and keep the country from being laid down. We produced half of the total amount raised. That situation went on until the Depression. In 1923, Mr. Lewis called a strike the anthracite field. Anthracite had then passed over the picture as a valuable piece of merchandise. That got nowhere. To support it, he then called out all of the union soft coal mines in the country and attempted to stir up trouble in the non-union mines. It wasn't successful, and at the end of 8 months, he had to give up and abandon the attempt to throttle the country. When it had been going on, his strike, 2 or 3 months, Mr. Hoover, then the Secretary of Commerce, called us non-union people to Washington and said, "You're the only suppliers of coal, and if left uncontrolled, you will be able, if you are that short-sighted, to ask any price you want for coal out of all reason, I want you to agree on a reasonable price in this emergency and not go beyond it. We all agreed. The price was fixed a couple of dollars below what it had gotten to. As I remember, it had gotten to $5. He put it at $3. Those figures may be slightly off, but the principle is clear. And we abided by that. But when the Depression came, the Norfolk Western people were well organized, the operators, and they kept the operators in line. New River was reasonably well organized in the operator group. I'm sorry to say the Winding Gulf Operators Association was not. Mines had just been opened on stone coal by people who had never been in the coal business, a lot of them, and who had no feeling of responsibility for the future, and they went to taking advantage of the situation, cutting the wages way below what people like Slab Falk, myself, coppers were holding at, and then making the, for instance, the men who operated the locomotive, gathering locomotives, if they could do it in 8 hours, gather all of the coal that was loaded, they got that cheap pay for 8 hours. If they couldn't and had to work 10 or 12 hours, they got the same cheap pay. Well, when Mr. Roosevelt was elected and announced that he wanted everybody, including white-collar people, to join unions, they had a seedbed of discontent in the county here that made it a pushover for the union. Mr. Lewis borrowed $300,000 from the American Federation of Labor, the president, Green, whom a year or two later he publicly stated amounted to nothing above his neck. That was a gratitude Mr. Green got for lending $300,000. Our people did not want to join the union, and it was a year after all the rest of the smokeless field organized before they got a majority here. I told our people that it wasn't worth being insulted in Beckley when he went over there, the women folks and children, that if I were them, I'd go ahead, pass under the yoke, which we did a year after everyone else had. We never had any trouble here, and even after we organized, we never had a strike here unless Lewis had called the whole country out on strike. Then there was nothing else for them to do. But we never had a local strike.
Tams seems to have been a quiet haven in a rather troubled world. How did you see the town in relation to the rest of the world?
I think that the main advantage we had here was that I was president of the company, had complete authority over every phase of the mining, the engineering, and the selling of the coal. Any sore spot that originated here could be cleared up and settled in 10 minutes. The same was practically true, but my good neighbor, Slab Falk, Mr. Gaston Captain, had similar authority. The rest of the mines, generally speaking, had superintendents who, regardless of how competent they were, had to refer policy questions back to the representative of the owners. We had the advantage of not having to let anything come to a point where something sore could develop. Today, of course, that has no meaning because nobody lives at the coal mines. It's perfectly all right to have a hired man, a competent technician, as vice president in charge of operation. He drives over to the mine in the morning if he comes at all. People who operate in the mine drive from anywhere from 10 to 25 miles, so there are no problems of living at all. The only problems that a mine could have today is what goes on inside the mine, and the contract with the union specifies just how those questions are to be handled. So not having any towns anymore, the questions that came up in my day no longer exist. And I would like to make a statement there that people driving by roads, or what few people still use trains going through the coal fields, only see old abandoned coal mining towns that haven't been in operation for years, and they leave the state saying, my God, what horrible looking places coal miners have to live in. I passed through a place that all the windows were out of the houses. Just think of the miners having to live in places like that.
And they don't live there at all?
Of course they don't live there. Even the rats don't live there anymore.
What happens to coal mining now? What do you see as the future of coal mining?
The future? It's, what's the future of any business? The coal mining has gone like other businesses in the United States into great groups that will get larger and less in number. And I think that this country will face very soon a decision of whether the administration that's elected by the people will not have to take over practically these big corporations. They will have gotten to a size that they will have to be so regulated that you might as well go the whole hog and run them by the, if the administration has to pass laws and form commissions to regulate all businesses, why having to get so many people in government employ? Why not the government take them over?
Can someone start a coal company like you did today?
It would be impossible. When I was given this lease, I formed a company at $200,000 capital. It was considered tremendous. Nobody else opening on the Gulf had quite that big a capital. If today, at 25, a young engineer, I was offered the same 3,000 acres, I couldn't possibly raise the capital to operate it because it would now take at least $9 million to open the mine and build the preparation plant. The customer today isn't satisfied with 5.5% ash, he wants 5%. To get that additional 0.5% reduction in the ash costs an extra $2 million in your preparation plant, and principally in what you have to reject. My neighbor operating just above here, Mr. Caperton, Slab Fork Coal Company, is rejecting 25% of everything he mines. When he brings a ton of coal outside, he throws away 1/4 of a ton, which is about 9 or 10% ash, No, I'm wrong there. It's considerable more than that, but it starts at 9% and builds up to an average of 20. And he sells 3/4 of a ton. But it costs him just as much to mine, in fact more, because it costs to dispose of hauling it away, costs more to mine the 1/4 of a ton that he don't sell than it costs him to mine for 1/4 of a ton the 3/4 he does sell. So you couldn't, no young fella today could possibly open a coal mine unless he was the son of a multimillionaire and got his father's $9 million. He'd never assembled 9 on his own. I think that's obvious.
How long did you run the coal mine here?
Yeah?
How long was it in operation?
I loaded the first ton of coal October the 1st, 1909, and I sold out in October 1955.
46 years. You've been
46 years.
You've been out of the business for a good many years now. Now in retirement, how do you spend your time?
That's an almost improper question to ask a man of my age. You spend it waiting for the end. If you've got any sense and face facts, you know that you're living on borrowed time and you amuse yourself as best you can, principally reading. I've always liked to read, and man that's bachelor, not married, not picked at by children and his wife all the time, has plenty of time to read and plenty of quiet to do it in.
Thank you very much, Major Tams.
This pre-recorded program was produced with the assistance of Westmoreland Coal Company.